Lecture number 6. We're going to start the second half of this section of material by studying the natural vegetation regions that match up with the climate regions. And this is part 1 of the natural vegetation. So let's define it. Natural vegetation is the native plant cover of an area that's adapted to climate. So meaning the vegetation is adapted to the precipitation and temperature regime particular to each climate. And as a matter of fact, if you take a look at this natural vegetation region map of the world, you take a look at it and it really has a high degree of correspondence to the climate map. I mean, it looks very, very similar. And the reason why the maps kind of match up is because the natural vegetation regions are adapted to the climate. So the map should be very similar. All right, and so we're going to go through the natural vegetation regions. Now, the numbers don't mean anything. They're just to keep us organized. And so don't worry about that. The first one is called the tropical rainforest, and that's the term we're going to use. But it's also could be called the equatorial rainforest. I mean, for this forest is found near the equator, but we'll just use the more common term. Well, anyways, the tropical rainforest is very much associated with the first climate we did, the wet equatorial climate. And you can see the map, with this forest astride the equator, just like we saw with the wet equatorial climate. Now remember, it's hot all year, really no annual temperature range, 80 degrees all year long, and it's very rainy all year long, 100, 200, 300, or even more inches of precip per year. So in terms of the vegetation, let's see how it's adapted to this hot and wet climate. All right, so since it is hot and wet all year, right, the plants and the trees have a continuous growing season. So that means the trees of the tropical/equatorial rainforest are referred to as broadleaf evergreen. So they're evergreen trees. They're not deciduous. Deciduous means they drop their leaves. So these trees have leaves, as opposed to needles. So they have, regular sized leaves. They're called broadleaf evergreen. So these are trees that have leaves and they maintain their leaves all year long. Now there is a period of leaf regeneration, here and there, but there's no major period of leaf drop like we have during the fall of the year in the northern hemisphere. Well, anyway, so there's no really need for the trees to drop their leaves. Trees are only going to do that if there's a period of drought or if it's too cold, and so they'll go dormant. And so the trees are broadleaf evergreen. Now another thing about the tropical equatorial rainforest is the speciation. Is the greatest on earth. Tremendous speciation. Now you can take maybe 1 square mile, right, of the tropical rainforest, and you could probably count, or a biologist would, hundreds of different species. I mean, that's tremendous speciation. And it's all due to the fact that there's a continuous growing season, since the last ice age, over the last tens of thousands of years. And what we're going to see is there's going to be a correspondence between the length of the growing season and the speciation. Now, here in South Louisiana, we're not a tropical rainforest, we're a subtropical rainforest. And so we do have a period of dormancy during, the winter months. And because we have a shorter growing season, we are not going to find hundreds of species per square mile. I mean, around here, probably in Louisiana, if you could ever find a virgin forest, which you probably can't, but probably maybe 20, 30, or 40 different species per square mile in what was the original forest in the southeastern United States. All right, let's talk about some of the adaptations to this hot and wet climate. And so we're going to go over several. All right, the first adaptation that you're going to find in the tropical equatorial rainforest are what are known as tall emergent trees. And here we've got the regular canopy at about the same height. And what the adaptation is that there are certain species of trees that grow extra high, and they emerge from the canopy so that they can get the sunlight. And what you wind up with is a dense canopy, right, in this forest. And typically the forest floor is very much shaded, and so there's a constant competition for sunlight. And so this is one adaptation to get the sunlight. And, a lot of people like to go to Costa Rica, or if you ever in your traveling, go to a tropical place, you'll probably take a zip line or maybe a canopy walk in the tropical rainforest. And what you're going to see, in this case, this canopy walk, actually the walkways or the zip lines are actually attached to the tall emergent trees, and so you'll be zipping through or walking through the regular canopy. All right, yeah, and so here I am when I was a graduate school at LSU 100 years ago. But you know what? Since the canopy is so dense, all right, and the forest floor is so shaded, any ground cover that you're going to find is going to have very, very large leaves. Like even if you go to the tropical section of your local nursery, you'll notice that the tropical plants that you might want to buy all have very, very large leaves. And so what is this adaptation? Because of the dense canopy, due to the high rainfall and the amount of shade, plants tend to have very, very large leaves to increase their chances of getting a little bit of sunlight to carry on photosynthesis. Now, I remember we were at the side of the road, and it was cloudy and rainy here, on and off and what have you. And we had to wait kind of a long time to get a little break in the clouds to get some sun so we could actually see, get a nice picture of this one plant. Now, this plant is called the gunnera in the tropics. Locally, well, this was taken in Costa Rica. It's called the poor man's umbrella because it grows on a stalk. And, if you get caught, unexpectedly in a tropical downpour, you just take your machete. Of course, everyone has a machete in the tropical rainforest. And you cut the stalk and use the plant leaf as a poor man's umbrella. And actually, the leaves can even be, twice as large as this. I mean, so this was just by the roadside. Yeah, another adaptation to the forest. It's kind of a surprising one. The roots tend to be shallow. Now, these are pretty big trees. I mean, 150 feet tall. And you would think that since you've got a large tree, that you'd have a deep anchor root, right, to support the girth of the tree. But here's an example of a relatively small mahogany tree. Here's the main trunk, and it toppled over. And you can actually see, since it toppled over, you can see the spreading shallow roots that have been pulled on up. And the reason why the roots don't go deep, where you think they should, is because of the fertility of the soil. The soils in the tropical and equatorial regions are really very, very poor. It's kind of shocking that the soils are so terrible. And it's because there's really no leaf litter. Now remember, there's no major period of leaf drop, right? And the leaves are the things that break down and decay and add humus or fertility to the soil. So that's one thing. And so, the most fertility that you're going to get is right at the surface where there is a little bit of leaf drop and leaf decay. And another thing, too, is the high rainfall. Hundreds of inches of precipitation per year washes through the upper layers of the soil and really takes any nutrients, that have been added from the leaf litter and washes it away to the water table. And so the soils are very, very poor, and the most nutrition you're going to get is really in the upper few inches or upper foot of the soil. Now, another adaptation to kind of account for that, since you've got some enormous trees, with an enormous girth and, heights up to 150 feet. In order to support the tree, there's an adaptation. Right? It's called a buttress. And so what a lot of the trees have, a lot of the big ones have, since they don't have, a deep anchor root, is they have wound up creating a greatly widened base. It's almost like wall-like roots extending away from the base of the tree to support the tree, since the root system doesn't do that. And you can see a person here, in comparison, and here's a person here. And so it's very, very typical to see these large buttresses. Now, you're actually kind of familiar with buttressing here in South Louisiana, maybe not to the extent of, that we see here. But the cypress trees that grow in the swamps in South Louisiana, they have large buttresses. Now, why would a cypress tree have a large buttress at its base in the swamp. Well, okay, it's a swamp, and it's, a soggy, muddy, wet substrate that's really quite unstable. And so the tree will have an adaptation to support itself better in a swampy situation that we have here in South Louisiana. All right, another really common feature of the tropical rainforest are woody vines. That root at the in the forest floor, and the vines start growing on up the trees, and over decades they start to develop a hard outer bark. And so here, and they're called lianas. They're very, very common. And so what they do is they grow up the trees, and they're searching for sunlight. And so they wind up growing from tree to tree to tree, wrapping around the canopy and trying to make its way, up to the top to get sunlight. And we've got lianas here in Louisiana. I'll be showing you a picture of it when we get to our forest. But so we're, like I said, we're a subtropical rainforest, and so a point that we're going to make is that there are a lot of similarities, to the tropical rainforest. Well, anyways, here's a guy here. I mean, yeah, grabbing one of the lianas, and like if you were Tarzan or George of the Jungle. I mean, that's kind of the main way that you get around in the jungle. All right, and what did George of the Jungle do? I mean, he always wound up, to watch out for the tree right there. But that's so very common in the tropical rainforest, these woody vines. Another thing, too, that really kind of makes the tropical rainforest, once you get really into it, are what are known as epiphytes. And these are plants that actually grow in the bark of the trees. They kind of root. And so you've got, plants growing all over the limbs of the tropical rainforest trees. And so you have various types of ferns and moss, and here's some lichen here. And there's also some beautiful flowers that will emerge too. Here's a bromeliad, and they put out flowers. This one, has died out. But if you're familiar with orchids too, and orchids are definitely an epiphyte, just like bromeliads. If you ever buy an orchid, they're very beautiful. But if you ever take a look at the inside, there's no soil, right? The actual inside the container is actually bark, right? Because that's what these epiphytes, like to root in. All right. Okay, so those are some of the adaptations to the tropical/equatorial rainforest that's hot and wet all year. Let's move on to the savanna. All right, now, what is a savanna? Now, we don't have any savanna in the United States, so you may not be so familiar with it. But really what it is, it's a grassland, vast grassland, with scattered to occasional tropical trees. So you're only going to find the savanna natural vegetation region within the tropics. And it's very much associated with the wet, dry tropical climate. Now, this is the one that's always found astride the wet equatorial. All right, so just, immediately north and south of the Amazon, immediately north and south of the Congo, and then in other places in Southeast Asia. But, what we had said about the location of the wet, dry tropical, is major areas, in tropical Africa and tropical South America. And again, it really is Africa that is really most famous with the tropical savannas. Now, this was one of the harder climates that you have to remember when the dry season in and when is the wet season in, and why. Now, the winter is dry, right? That's when the subtropical high moves into this latitude range. And then the summer is very, very rainy. That's when the equatorial low and or intertropical convergence zone moves in. So really, you've got 6 months of drought. And remember, there are like several months on average over the last 30 years with no precip. And then the rains come, and our climate graph said 70 or 80 inches, but you could actually get well over 100 or 200 inches during the summer rains. Yeah, so here we are in Africa, right, in southern Africa, and so here's the winter drought. Now, the thing about the trees, right, in the tropical trees in the savanna, is that they are going to drop their leaves. There is a reason now for the trees to be deciduous, because there's about 4 to 6 month period of extreme drought. So the trees have to go dormant, and so they drop their leaves. They're deciduous. And then the grasses will brown and kind of go dormant also. So it's a very dry and brown environment during the winter drought. Now, the famous thing about the tropical savanna is it's known as a rain-green environment. And I'm going to give you the definition of rain-green, and maybe the definition will help you remember, what season is wet and what season is dry. And here's the baobab tree here now during the rainy, wet season. All right, so this is the definition. With the onset of the first summer rains, and that's kind of it, how you remember it, the onset of the first summer rains, the leaves bud practically overnight and the grass is green. And it really is kind of a fast, thing that happens with the first rains. Pretty much within a week, everything greens right on up, and depressions will fill with water, and you'll have lakes and swamps, and just a totally opposite looking landscape. So this is called a rain green. As soon as it rains, everything turns like almost immediately green. Yeah, another thing about the tropical savannas, again, so famous in Africa, this is the location of the big game animals that you find there. So people go on safari, and so if you ever do go on safari, you'll be in the tropical savannas, in southern and eastern Africa. And here's some pictures here. And so here you can see the savanna. Here's very, very dry looking, kind of intermediate season. And so this is where you're going to find, the lions and elephants and giraffes. And I remember watching the Lion King movie about 1 million times with my son, when it came on out in the 90s. And I remember that final scene, after those horrible hyenas, burnt the place on down, and Simba had the birth of his little son, little baby there, and he was up on Pride Rock, looking over the devastated, burn of the savannah. Then, what happened? It started to rain, and magically, within minutes, the tropical savanna turned, lush and green, and everything was renewed again. So, the final scene of that movie I really like, because it really does demonstrate, Disney in Disney form, the rain green environment of the tropical savanna. All right, let's move on to the third one, the desert natural vegetation region. Now, this is going to match up with our subtropical high deserts, the dry tropical and dry subtropical climates. And so, again, remember here, this is where we actually finally got into the United States, the Southwest U.S. So you can actually see, here we are, with our dry climates, due to the subtropical high. All right, now plants can grow in the desert. Now, with an exception, you'll have vast sand seas where there's absolutely no precipitation, in the Arabian and areas of the Saharan desert. But, we're in areas where you get, even a couple of inches of precip per year, you do have vegetation. And the natural vegetation that can grow in, the desert conditions are called xerophytes. Xero meaning dry in Latin, and phytes meaning plants. Now, you remember xero meaning dry for the Xerox machine. When the Xerox machine was invented in like the 60s, it was kind of a revelation that you could copy something and the copy would come out dry instead of wet. Prior to the Xerox machine, now I'm showing my age, they used a mimeograph, and you had to crank it around with your hand, and you got wet copies that had to dry on out. And so xero means dry. Well, let's talk about some of the adaptations to the extreme drought conditions of the desert, where you usually get less than maybe 12 inches of precip per year. And I want to go over 3 adaptations. The first adaptation has to do with the root system again. And the root system is really one of 2 things, okay? There are plants that tend to have a shallow and spreading root system, like the famous saguaro. Here's the the spelling here. It's so famous in the Sonoran Desert of Arizona. And these have very shallow roots. And the reason why they would have shallow roots is when you do get the occasional downpour, you've got the roots right at the surface, and hopefully then that they can actually take in and store that rainwater. And so here are these giant saguaros, and I'm only 5 feet tall, and so this one is 5, 10, 15, 20 feet tall. They're actually enormous, and they store water. And when there is a rainy season, they actually kind of bulge on out and become really fat and plump. And really, I mean, when they are filled with water, the internal structure is kind of wood-like, and with all that moisture, literally these things weigh a ton. People are surprised, and especially one like this that's 20 or 25 feet tall. They say never to stand next to one because the shallow root systems, and they weigh a ton. I mean, you could have maybe a gust come through, and these things topple on over and actually kill people. So, do as I say, don't do as I do. All right. And then the other thing is, another incredible thing is the root system can be very, very deep. Tens of feet deep, or even 100 feet deep. And the root systems of, the small trees that are growing, the roots grow very, very rapidly. Very rapidly, and they're searching for the groundwater. Right, and so they have deep, deep tap roots that grow incredibly deep. And so this is like a mature mesquite tree in Arizona. And I remember, well, I've got a house in Arizona, and we wanted to plant some trees, and we got Palo Verde, small Palo Verde, really not even more than a foot tall. And we wanted to dig it up in the desert and put it in our yard. You couldn't get at it. You're hacking at the hard ground, and that root system of that 1 foot tall Palo Verde was already probably 10 or 20 feet deep. And so it really is quite amazing how fast the root systems grow with that tapped root. The second adaptation is many of the plants are succulents, specifically the cactus or the cacti, plural. And so the cacti are plants with greatly thickened spongy tissue that store the rainwater. So when you do get a rain, they'll take in the rainwater and they can store it. And so the plants really plump on up. And this is the prickly pear, which is really a really common succulent out in the desert. And here's a barrel cactus. And again, I mean, they'll really plump on up after a rain. And if it's been really dry for a very long period of time, they'll all shrivel on up. But when they are filled with water, they really are, quite succulent and juicy. And so a lot of the animals, that live in the desert, like to, chew and eat, and get water actually from these plants. And it's kind of another adaptation, since the animals like to eat the fleshy tissue. Well, the prickly pear now, I mean, and that's why many of the succulents and a lot of the plants in the desert have adapted by growing these spiky spines, I mean, that really tear you apart if an animal tries to bite on into it and to try to keep the animal away. And then a lot of the animals have actually adapted to the spines, and their digestive systems can actually handle these spines. So it kind of goes on and on and on in terms of adaptations. The third and final xerophytic adaptation is that any plant that grows in the desert, dry tropical, dry subtropical, and if it has leaves, the leaves are going to be tiny. They're going to be very, very small. They're going to be leathery, and they're usually going to have maybe a waxy coating on them. And it's kind of the opposite as in the tropical equatorial rainforest, where it's so shady, where you want a large leaf to try to, get some sun to carry on photosynthesis. This is the opposite. There's just, too much sun throughout the year. And so the plants need to reduce this surface area to reduce, evaporation rates. End.